Hello. So this presentation, as you can see here, is on cultural relativism, in particular, ethical cultural relativism. Hard to say that word all of a sudden for some reason. Just relativism in general, regardless of what it's applied to. The term relativism just means, as I say here, some kind of truth or knowledge, understanding, or something that's relative to who's considering it. So you might say, what's true for you is true for you, but it's not true for me. So in that case, it would be truth relativism, relativism about what's true. And so cultural relativism in ethics is just applying that concept to ethics. What's true about ethics or morality, our moral codes, is relative to culture. Another way of saying that is that culture determines what our moral codes are, determines what's right and wrong and what's good and bad, entirely determined by culture. So this isn't an argument in favor of cultural relativism here. It's just a variety of things that cultural relativists might say. There's no objective standard by which to judge everyone. So there's no one system of ethics or one set of moral codes that apply to everybody equally. There's no way to say that one culture is right and one culture is wrong. If there's a cultural practice that seems to be immoral to you, well, that's just immoral according to your own culture. According to their culture, it's the morally correct thing to do. So for them, it's morally correct, even though if you were doing a similar thing in your own culture, it might be morally wrong. So the moral code of our own society or your own society has no special status. It only is true for you, for your culture. And so when people try to say that some other cultures got it wrong, that's kind of arrogance, or almost like a cultural imperialism, imposing your own culture's standards on somebody else, on somebody else's culture. So what is the argument in favor of cultural relativism? Well, I'm going to bounce back to the first slide here. I'm drawing upon James Rachel's really good chapter in his really good book that discusses this. And so this is really kind of the basic argument. It's about as simple of an argument as you can get, a single premise and then a conclusion. It starts from just the observation that different cultures do in fact have different moral codes, and then concluding that therefore there is no objective universal truth and morality that applies to everybody, that applies to all cultures. Right and wrong and good and bad, they vary from culture to culture. So this is a question about the argument being valid, in particular deductively valid. That draws upon some knowledge of logic and what it means to be deductively valid, which we won't go into here. This is really just asking, how good of an argument is this really? Well, it turns out that this is, if you know about deductive validity and those issues from logic, that this is an invalid argument, that even if the premise is true, which it seems like the premise probably is true, that doesn't automatically guarantee that this conclusion is also true. And in order to see that a little more clearly, let's look at another argument that's got a very similar structure. It's just changing the topic. So different cultures have different views concerning the shape of the earth. So therefore, there is no objective universal truth concerning the shape of the earth. The shape of the earth varies from culture to culture. So there it might be a little more obvious how this is not a very good argument. But it's got the same structure. It starts with this observation that different people or different cultures, different groups, one way or another, have different views about this topic, and then concludes that because of that, there must not be any objective truth concerning this topic. Now, of course, the shape of the earth, that's a physical issue, right? It's like, what is the physical shape of the earth? And that's something that we can measure and directly observe. So it's a little easier. But nevertheless, the point is that this kind of an argument is in no way decisive in terms of establishing the truth of this conclusion. When we get to, going back to the argument in terms of ethics, just because people disagree about what's true in ethics, that does not guarantee that there is no truth about ethics, or that truth just varies from culture to culture. We need to have some other considerations, right? What are other reasons in favor of cultural relativism? So just the fact that there are differences, and each culture seems to believe quite strongly, especially people who have really embedded themselves in that culture and they're very committed to a particular culture, they may be very convinced that they're right, but just because people are convinced that they're right about their own culture, the truth of their own culture, and the falsity of other cultures, it doesn't automatically mean that there's no truth, or that truth is only relative to culture. There's sort of a historical reason as to why cultural relativism has sort of risen to a place of somewhat greater prominence in academia than it once held. You go back several decades, and in academia, people would never have considered, or rarely have considered, cultural relativism to be a viable option. But we have become more aware of the kind of cultural imperialism that is, to say the least, extremely problematic, right? So in particular, you look at the European colonial period, and they were going into Africa and the Americas mainly, but also other places in Asia, and colonizing, right? Setting up their own colonies and imposing their culture and their legal systems and their religions on the cultures that they found there, or simply eradicating those cultures or eradicating the people. And of course, this was done, for economic reasons largely, but it wasn't uncommon to hear justifications for this colonial practice in terms of cultural imperialism. That they would see this culture, the native culture, and say like, oh, they're wrong. We Europeans, we know what the proper system of ethics is, or the proper religion is, and it's up to us, we enlightened people, to show these people the right way to live, right? The ethically correct system of ethics. And if they're not willing to comply, well, then we eradicate them, or we imprison them, or enslave them, or whatever it might be. Well, clearly this is a horrible historical practice that still has many effects playing out still today. And so the more we became aware of how horrible this attitude was, that prompted people to take cultural relativism more seriously. That instead of thinking that your own culture has it correct, other cultures are wrong, so therefore it's up to you to impose your so-called correct culture on the so-called wrong cultures. Once we recognize how terrible that is, that maybe we should shift to this attitude of tolerance and respect. That yes, other cultures are different. Yes, some of those cultural practices might make us uncomfortable, but that's just because our culture is different, and we should respect those other cultures. So therefore, perhaps we should stop saying that there's one correct system of ethics that applies to everybody, and instead be more respectful about these different moral codes that exist in different cultures. So this is a pretty compelling argument in favor of some kind of cultural relativist attitude. However, there are a variety of serious problems associated with embracing cultural relativism fully. Adopting the attitude that everything about ethics is entirely determined by culture. So let's look at some of the arguments against cultural relativism then. Well, one of the most obvious ones is that there's just no way to morally denounce very bad practices that a culture thinks are okay, or that a culture thinks is good. And that's true, if you're trying to denounce practices in another culture, you see that there's some other culture is doing something that you really disagree with. But if you adopt cultural relativism, then you just have to say, well, that's their culture, and there's nothing I can really say to denounce it. I'm not justified in denouncing it. All I can really say is that it's different than my culture. But that's also true for your own culture. If you recognize something in your own culture that you disagree with, well, if you're a cultural relativist, then you're the one who has it wrong. You know, according to cultural relativism, the culture is correct. The culture determines what ethics is. So if you disagree with what the culture is telling you about your system of ethics, then you're the one who's wrong, because the culture is always right. Okay, so there's some famous examples here. So we might consider, say, like the Nazis, Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. So that's a pretty straightforward example of an ethically horrible practice. But if cultural relativism is the correct attitude here, then we might have to say, oh, well, that's just Nazi culture. Within Nazi culture, they thought that this is the correct thing to do, so they're correct that that's the right thing to do, to slaughter millions, systematically slaughter millions of people on an industrial scale, just because they think that those people are somehow inferior or just not worthy to be part of the society. It's like, well, that's what their culture believes, so we just have to accept that as being the correct practice within that culture. Like, well, that seems like it's going a little far, right? That's kind of hard to accept. Now, that's not an absolutely decisive argument against cultural relativism. Somebody who's really committed to cultural relativism, they may feel a little uncomfortable with that result, but nevertheless, they might say, yeah, that's the attitude we're supposed to take. But, most people, I think, would be very unwilling to say that Nazi culture should be left alone. We have no justification for saying that what they did was wrong. There's also no such thing as moral progress. Literally no such thing as moral progress within a culture. It's merely difference over time. So if we look at, say, roughly speaking, American culture, obviously there's still a wide variety of problems that people will identify with American culture today, but we might say it's better than it was 200 or 300 years ago. In terms of civil rights, the way we treat women in a variety of ways, how they have been given voting rights and all these other things. So there might be a variety of ways that we say that our culture now has made moral progress compared to the way it was in the past. Now, there also might be some ways in which we might think that our culture is morally worse now than it was in the past. But that's also impossible, according to cultural relativism. So you can't say really that a culture has gotten morally better or morally worse over time. All you can really say is that it's changed. Now, why is that? Well, in order to judge that a culture has actually gotten morally better over time, you would need to have some independent standard that you're judging that culture the way it was in the past and the way it was now. And it's sort of increased on the scale, right? It's better now than it was in the past. But cultural relativism just denies that there is such an independent scale for judging those sorts of things. Whatever the culture says is the right thing to do right now, that is the right thing to do now. Whatever the moral code is today in a culture, that's the correct moral code for that culture. So morality ends up looking something more like fashion. Right? So you might look at fashion from several decades ago and you say, oh my gosh, the fashion back then was just so terrible. Our fashion is so much better now. Well, there just is no objective independent standard by which we can measure the quality of fashion. That really does seem to be something that's culturally determined. All we can really say in any sort of objectively clear sense is that fashion changes over time. There's no real objective way to say that fashion gets better or gets worse over time. It just changes. So according to cultural relativism, morality, ethics is very much the same way as fashion. It just changes. Now there's an interesting question as to why the ethics might change over time. Why do the moral codes change over time? Why do they change in the particular ways that they have changed over time? So that's an interesting question for anthropologists or sociologists. And they can sort of give us some answers and some interesting insights there, but that's different than saying that the changes constitute an improvement or a degradation over time. That's a value judgment, and values, ethics, morality is determined by the culture. So those might change, but there's no independent standard for saying whether they're better or worse than they used to be. Okay. Now here's another thing. There might be actually more or less disagreement than it appears. Remember, the primary reason in favor of cultural relativism is observing that there just actually are these really dramatic differences in moral codes from culture to culture. So let's look at that one in a little bit more detail. For one thing, there might actually be some basic values that are shared among all cultures. Things like a prohibition on murder, just unjustified killing, just randomly killing people whenever you want. There just is no culture that says that that's okay. Every culture has a basic prohibition against just random murder, random killing. Truth-telling might be something similar. Different cultures sort of take that seriously to different extents. Some cultures may put a very high priority on honesty. Other cultures, maybe not so much. But by and large, every culture is going to sort of look down on systematic lying all the time. Now, we might say that a culture just can't survive very long if it doesn't abide by some of these basic values. No murder, basic respect for the truth, basic nurturing for children. These are ethical issues, but nevertheless, if there's a culture that says, oh yeah, babies don't matter, you should never bother taking care of babies, well, that culture is obviously not going to last very long. So even if there ever was a culture that was like that, it's long gone by now. Okay, another issue might be that the application of these basic values does end up being different from culture to culture. And we need an explanation for that, right? So at rock bottom, all cultures might share the same values, but the way they're sort of put into practice, obviously there's huge divergence there. And it's very difficult to say that one culture's moral practice is automatically wrong and another culture's is right. So how do we sort through? What's the explanation for all these radical differences from culture to culture? Well, what James Rachel's in this chapter that I was talking about, and that I'm basing all of this on, suggests that there might actually be factual errors here that are going on. So, for example, let's look at Nazi culture again, right? That they were systematically slaughtering, for example, Jewish people. Well, why were they doing that? Did they think that it's just good to murder people? Like, no. Nazis, they have this reputation for doing all these horrible things, but they didn't think that it was okay to just murder people all the time. It was only certain groups. So why did they think that those groups, it was okay to murder them, but not okay to murder, so Aryans, blonde hair, blue-eyed people with the proper heritage? Well, they thought that people with a different heritage were somehow lesser, not fully human, they didn't have full personhood the way the Aryans did. Well, that's just wrong, right? I mean, it's just factually wrong. It's not an ethical judgment, it's just factually incorrect. So they might have the same sort of basic value starting point, but they applied it in an incorrect way because they made this factual error. So it's not a disagreement over ethics, it's a disagreement over facts, right? Something more like the shape of the earth. Are Jewish people fully human? Yes, absolutely they are. If you don't think that they are, then you're just factually incorrect about that. Another example that I bring up in many of my classes is so human sacrifices. So if at least we're told that some culture like the Aztec culture practiced human sacrifices. So is it because they just didn't think humans had value and it's like, well, let's just kill them and that's it? No, of course not. They were killing them for a reason. So for example, they might perform a human sacrifice in order to ensure that they get a good harvest next year. right? To please the gods that are in control of harvesting and in control of the agriculture. And so they kill a human being in order to get better crops. Well, is that how agriculture actually works? No, right? They were just wrong about that. You know, and we don't want to sort of judge them for being mistaken about that, because they didn't have enough information to know perhaps how agriculture actually works. But nevertheless, like, it's a factual error to think that killing a person is going to produce better crops. So it's not a basic value difference. It's a factual error, or a difference in basic knowledge about facts that's different from culture to culture. Okay, we talked about that. So the idea is that rather than just sort of embracing the differences between cultures and saying there's no way to say that one culture has a certain ethical issue right and another culture has an ethical issue wrong, there actually is room for disagreement and sort of debating and coming to some reasoned conclusions and showing that one culture is maybe making some actual errors in their reasoning, or they just don't have the facts straight. And that's something that we can debate a little bit more easily than debating sort of these basic values being different from culture to culture. All right, so here's then the last problem, and I think perhaps the most difficult problem for cultural relativism, because everything I've said so far, you know, a cultural relativist could say, you know, I recognize that those are difficulties, but nevertheless, I'm going to hang on to cultural relativism because I really believe it's the right approach to ethics. So here's this other consideration. You know, let's say that somebody is convinced by cultural relativism and they've decided, okay, I'm going to be a cultural relativist from now on, and so now I want to figure out what the right thing to do is, so I'm going to consult my culture to tell me. Well, so now we immediately hit a problem. What does constitute my culture? When I say I'm going to consult my culture to tell me what the right moral code is, what is it that I'm consulting exactly? Just like political boundaries or geographic boundaries, that's not sort of what bounds a culture. That's not what defines a culture. So I might perhaps belong to this vague thing called American culture. It's not clear that there is a single thing that's American culture. We're famously divided. We've got at least 2 major camps in the United States right now, politically, maybe ethically as well. But then there's a wide variety of subcultures. There's differences between, you know, what we might call American culture versus Colorado culture, where I'm living in Colorado right now. And there might be differences. In fact, there are cultural differences between Colorado taken as a whole versus my area of Colorado here in Boulder, where I live. There's some cultural quirks and some things that are quite different, perhaps, than the state culture and also from the country culture. Then, you know, obviously, like, I'm on a university campus a lot. I belong to the University of Colorado at Boulder. And so there's some cultural issues that show up there that are different than the city of Boulder's culture. So which culture am I looking at to tell me what the right thing to do is? It seems like I belong to multiple overlapping cultures. And those overlapping cultures might be giving me conflicting moral advice about what the right thing to do is. So which one am I supposed to follow? It seems like I'm kind of stuck. And there might be some areas of the world that have a very homogeneous culture, so they don't have as much difficulty in trying to sort through all the different overlapping cultures and subcultures that they belong to. But a lot of places, especially places like the United States, it seems like kind of a hopeless tangle of cultures that we belong to, and we can't sort of pick out one that's going to be our primary moral guide and the other ones just aren't. You know, if we took this business that I was just talking about, going from American culture to the state culture to the city culture to the campus culture, we keep narrowing that down and identifying smaller and smaller subcultures. we might get to the point where we've got a subculture that's constituted of just a couple people, or just me, right? I could say, you know what, I'm so different that I really make up my own culture. And I believe in cultural relativism, so I determine my own moral rules. Well, that's pretty convenient. And that's kind of the same as saying that there really is no ethics, right? If I determine what the moral rules are for myself, then I can just kind of do whatever I want and then just claim, well, that's my culture, right? That's my own culture of one, and I follow my own rules. And since cultural relativism is true, I can never be wrong. Well, that's basically like saying that there's just no such thing as ethics at all. So that seems unworkable. Okay, so these are the reasons against cultural relativism. But the upshot, right, is be very careful about assuming that your culture is morally correct and others are morally wrong. You know, don't be a cultural imperialist. But at the same time, criticism of cultural practices is allowable. We can figure out and have reasons and reasonable debates about certain cultural practices and decide whether there's some mistake that's going on. They're just not recognizing somebody's humanity, or they've gotten some scientific facts wrong, and so they're misusing people or mistreating people somehow because of some factual error that could be corrected. And then also be willing to recognize that your own beliefs that you've grown up with in your own culture, they might be wrong, right? Be willing to change your beliefs if you have good reasons, even if it ends up counting against your culture. Okay, well, I think I'm going to go ahead and stop there. So thank you.